Continuing conversation and discussion. Mayor Kenny and City Council. The first one. I'm sorry, public comments. I always forget that.
So anyone who'd like to comment in tonight's work session before we get going? Okay, seeing no one.
Sorry about that. We wanted to finalize the conversation tonight regarding the bond indebtedness and the ready to serve charge. At a previous meeting, council directed staff to remove the second meter ready to serve charge off that bill. We've moved forward with working through that. The question that was still being discussed by council is whether or not there was a desire by council to backfill that approximately $40,000 that ready to serve charge would leave off the revenue stream. We have, for council convenience, we have included in the packet tonight a memo for Mr. McCullough, which laid out the various bond projects that we've been talking about. I know we've gone over that with council on several occasions. I'm not sure if you would like for Jeff to go over that again. I'm not sure it's necessary. Again, you've heard it at least a couple of times, but we wanted to provide that memo to you to start having a conversation about whether or not the desire is to replace that ready to serve charge revenue.
Does the elimination of that ready to serve charge revenue accumulation over the life of that bond, does that affect our ability or the total amount we can ask for in a bond, because it affects the revenues that will be generated from that? Will we have to ask for or get less of a bond? When we were talking about that $3.2 million or whatever, does that affect that?
It would, that addition, that 40,000 a year, let's just use that as the number.
Yeah.
That is absent. Is figured into the financial projections for operations, maintenance, and debt service. So if we went forward with the bond as anticipated and that $40,000 wasn't there, then there would be a shortfall that would have to be either made up somewhere else in the budget, or the bond size would have to be reduced.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that when we went through the entire rate study, we anticipated this bond and those projects moving forward, as well as funding the depreciation of the $1.2 million in the future years. And so when we created the rate structure this year, it included that revenue from the ready to serve sprinklers as part of that overall revenue. And so even though that's new revenue that was created this year, it was intended to be able to support this bond issue.
My understanding was that if we raised the rates according to the schedule and kept with the scheduled increases through 2019, there would be no further need for bonds to complete other projects. Is that true or not true?
It included this bond, and then the intent is with those rates to be able to afford the future capital improvements without having to borrow money. The one exception that we pointed out during that rate study is that we're anticipating some project that will have to be constructed to close the last CSO at 5th and Ramsdale. And we're still waiting on the results of that final sanitary sewer evaluation study to be completed by Avonmarsh, which is really the sizing of an equalization basin. The funding of that, the results of that study will identify what project needs to be completed. It will also set up the project plan to be submitted and accepted by the state of Michigan so that we're eligible for state revolving fund loans. And so even though that's a long-term, short or 20-year low interest rate loan, technically that is a bond. But that's also anticipated in the future, though we don't know exactly how much that's going to cost or how big that project's going to be at this point.
Okay. I have concerns as I go back and look at budget and audit information. I see back in 2004, 2005, we had a water and sewer rate with a bond retirement fee in there of $41.70. As I look at the scheduled increases, as was presented, with 8.5% next year, 3.5% for the next 3 years, would end up with that same typical user paying $84.71 by 2019. That's over 100% increase in water rates. And we do have a lot of folks in town that are low income or sensitive to that kind of an increase in rate.
I think one thing to keep in mind to kind of put that in perspective is that since 2004, part of the reason that those water and sewer rates have increased is because we had a wastewater treatment plant expansion and we had 2 sewer separation projects. That accounts for the vast majority of the rate increases over that time period. The operations of the water and sewer utility are relatively stable and actually probably increase at less than an inflationary or a typical water and sewer inflationary rate. And in fact, the rate study pointed out that even with those rate increases for the water and sewer utility, it still lags behind what the industry average is. And that's just for information. That's what the rate consultant said. That's not to minimize the fact that the rates have gone up quite a bit since 2004, but they're really things that were kind of unavoidable based on what the state was requiring.
Yeah, if you remember, there was a slide is a slide in the rate study that shows the consumer price index, and it shows that the rate of being able to service and maintain water and sewer rates is at a much steeper incline than what a lot of other things are, and that Manistee is held quite a bit below the national average. So in that same period, even though we've had those extraordinary projects, the rates on a national average have increased by that same amount or more.
Okay. I just look at it and, I get concerned about the amount of overall debt that the city has. And I know those bonds that were issued back 2004, 2005, and subsequent, we're still paying one. And I'm assuming they were 20-year or so obligations. So we will be paying on those into the future, along with the additional bonds. I see numbers for the bonds pushing us pretty close to the $29 million mark in total indebtedness with this one. Is that considered a reasonable level of debt?
I think reasonable is entirely dependent on the needs of the water and sewer utility, since both state law and federal statutes require that we operate the system in order to maintain the system, operate it fairly, treat the water, and be in compliance with our permits. And given that we've had a lot of state mandates and required separation projects, I don't think our rates are out of line with those past requirements. They're set at the minimum level necessary to operate, maintain, and service the debt.
Do you have the list of projects that we're looking at for this bond?
Yes, Jeff provided that with the work session packet.
But I mean, that we can put up on the screen. Because we reduce our rates by 40,000. So in essence, we really have to relook at these projects and reduce the projects in that bond debt to accommodate the reduction in fees, unless we decide to make up the fees in another fashion.
Correct.
And so I guess the first step with the council is, are we interested in raising rates to make up that 40,000?
In the memo that I provided to council about a month ago, it would be about a 15-cent per 1,000 gallon increase, 15 cents per 1,000 on water.
In my opinion, that is, it is politely and respectfully as I can, a horrible option. We're talking about having the rest of the citizens that don't have sprinkler systems subsidize the ones that do. And now I know we're talking about sprinklers worth 700 and some sprinklers systems out of 4,000, and so we're asking 3,300 people to subsidize the 700 for the sprinkler system. I think that's a horrible decision to pass that cost on to the people that don't have a sprinkler system. That's my opinion.
Councilmember Guster, if I might, whether or not somebody is getting, quote, subsidized or not really depends on where you start from. And putting that on the volumetric charges, from one perspective, it's still, you're paying based on how much water you use. So the rate study anticipated that there was this ready to serve charge that was going to be applied to all meters, and that was what the rate consultant recommended. Council decided to remove that, and that impacted the system by $40,000. So the other option would be you could raise the ready to serve charge on all users for their meters to cover that, or you could do it as on a consumption basis, which still gives all users the ability to control that somewhat. And that seems to be the simplest option if council wanted to choose to raise that money. The other option would be to raise the ready to serve charge for water to a level that would make up that revenue. And that would be for
I mean,
all
you can
users.
say it however you want, Ed, and I respect all of your statistics, but at the end of the day, we've got to make up $40,000 that was built into a system that a council agreed to from a water and service rate study, and now we've got to make that up somewhere else. So whether we raise A to pay for B, in my opinion, it's the reason why we have to do that is because we're not following the rate study that we agreed to from the beginning. Again, whether it's right or wrong, that's where it lands, and I think that's where the voice of public opinion would land.
The other option would be to look at the projects and how much would we have to pull out of projects to make up for that 40,000.
And it would be significant because the inflated value of that dollar over 20 years is over $1 million.
Now, according to the bond, say we decided to take out, just for instance, the river sewer line at 1.5 million, because let's just say that we can't, with our current rate structure, we can't afford that bond payment on that. So we don't utilize the whole bond that we went out for, that we, was it 3 million, 3.2 million. So we don't go for the whole 3.2, we do something less than that. Say something happens in out the riverbank that causes us that we have to do something immediately. Can we then go back?
Well, the notice of intent was for up to 3.5 million. So we have the ability, if we issue less than that, to go back and issue additional bonds, but you incur an enormous amount of transaction fees to do that. It really becomes expensive to do it that way.
But the question is, if we reduce the bond down under Mayor Kenny's concept, if we reduce the bond down to, say, a $2 million bond rather than a $3.5 million bond, if we had a breach in the line, if I hear you correctly, Mayor Kenny, if we had a breach in that line in an emergency, would we be able to go back and utilize bond funds to fund
If
that?
the bond ordinance and authorizing resolution that's adopted says in one or more series of bonds, you would have the ability to go back and do that, but there are some time limits which I'd have to find out.
Okay, I was just trying to see if we couldn't match up what the debt incurred when we needed to incur it versus then looking at the rates at that time to.
I don't want to speak for the utility director, but if council is considering reducing the size of the bond, I think the Riverbank sewer, the 6th Avenue pump station, and the Maywood tank would be the ones that you would do, and you'd have to get rid of everything else based on a priority. He may have changed that perception. That's what we had discussed in the past, because those are the 3 most important projects.
Would agree with that. Back 2011-2012 budget was the first time the Riverbank sewer line was addressed as a need. But that like 3 or 4 years ago that it was initially considered for funding and replacement. I look at some other items. I don't dispute the needs that are on the list, but I wonder if there isn't better ways to handle some of the smaller items rather than bonding for a long period of time, such as the pump. Are there not other funds available, or could those be purchased through public works funding as opposed to incurring a long-term bond to finance that particular item or other items that are on the list?
Well, I always maintain that the pump should be purchased through the motor pool. That's what I think it should be done.
Councilmember Cody, you're referring to the portable pump?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
No,
what
you're not talking about any of the lift station upgrades. You're
No,
talking about
no, portable pump.
portable pump.
Yeah. That's not a project, and that's a piece of equipment. I believe that should be purchased through the motor pool, and that's not a large item either. I cannot see that in that list at all. I've said that from the very beginning, and I'm still saying it.
With that said, would you purchase the generator, the Renaissance Peak generator, through the motor?
You know, I think you're probably stretching the definition. If council wants to change the definition of what the motor pool's used for, they can certainly do that. But these are water and sewer assets that need to be paid for by the water and sewer fund. And that's the purpose of having the rates and charges set to accommodate that. Otherwise, you're impacting, buying 2 generators out of the motor pool is going to prevent you from getting the new snowplow that needs to be replaced down the road. And you need to match up the funding sources really with what they're being used for.
I think the portable pump, you could probably kind of mold that into a motor pool item. And I think you could do that. I think all of the generators, those aren't portable generators, those are stationary generators. They really in no way, shape, or form fit within that motor pool guidelines, Councilor Whitliff. They could we could attempt to purchase one a year, X number of years, through the standard budgeting process, budget for those, work through that, incorporate those into the capital improvement fund for the water and sewer fund. As you've seen that chart of projects going out, it would take multiple years to accomplish that. But absent bonding for them, I think that would be the logical way of looking at the lift station upgrades.
Isn't Century Terrace done?
Century Terrace, I think.
Yes.
Yes.
And so it's already been paid for. And if it's already paid for, why are we buying out money if we already paid for it?
Because we were required to do it by the DEQ within a certain time frame, and it was not a budgeted line item.
Is it paid for?
It's paid for.
Then why would we borrow money against it? It's paid for.
We wouldn't be, Councilmember Bixby. It was on this list originally, and
Okay.
subsequently it was approved to be closed.
We're still talking about a very relatively low dollar amount.
I know, yeah.
When we're, if you're looking at 1.1 million over the life of that loss, $40,000 is pretty.
I think the way Mr. Bradford put it out is really, and again, I don't want to speak for Jeff also, but I think if it's council's desire tonight, and we'd really like to get some direction tonight so we can continue to move this forward, if it's council's desire tonight to remove the $40,000 and keep that $40,000 off, I think that we really need to look at this list, and really what we're able to fund at that point in time would be the Maywood tank. We've all talked about the Maywood tank. If we don't make the repairs of the Maywood, we know what's going to happen. Our cost's going to go up. We are flirting with disaster on the Riverbank Sewer projects. It's got to be done. It's just, we've flirted with it for a long time, and we've continued to flirt with it, and we've got to do that particular project, and then the 6th Avenue pump station. But Jeff, would you concur with those?
The first two, certainly. We rated or scored all 10 of these and put them in a hierarchy as far as importance, and certainly we had the Maywood tank as number 1 because of the cost is going to triple if we don't do the project now. The Riverbank sewer, I think, is our biggest liability right now. We actually put the Sweetenham Pump Station upgrades number 3 because we've got half that station has failed and is under capacity, and we've got basements that are flooding, and it's hard for us to ignore that. The flow monitoring that's listed there is critical for us to size the basin that we need and to complete the SSES. From our perspective, the portable pump is one of the higher priorities because of all the different uses that it has and the versatility for each of the departments that it has, and also that it sets up for the bypass pumping of the future pump station upgrades and essentially will pay for itself. And then 6
something here?
Sure.
I'm not telling you not to get the pump. I'm just saying they shouldn't be on this list.
Right.
They should be, all right.
Yeah.
Is the flow monitoring already started? Are we already doing that?
We just started setting the meters last week. And so that's one of those, if it doesn't get paid for out of this issue, then we're going to have to defer some of the other capital projects that we have already been approved for, and then make room for the balance of that in the upcoming budget. And I mean, you can reorder any of these things, but these are items that need to be done, and when you don't do them, it just pushes things off into the future.
Well, and oftentimes, when we continue to kick the can down the road, they become much more expensive and much more significant the farther they get down the road. And some of these areas, like the Riverbank sewer line, has been pushed down the road for a significant amount of time.
The engineering on that project started in 2008. The estimate was $800,000 at that time.
And now we're at 1.5.
Because of the cost of steel and access from the water levels have gone up 2 feet. There's going to be more dewatering that's required. The excavation is going to be more complicated. So yeah, those are the type of things that happen. The portable pump, just as an example, the $43,000 that's listed there, we actually bid that pump out. We wanted to see exactly what it was, but we know that it went up by a couple $1,000s after the first of the year because the manufacturers all told us that it would.
In long-range planning and success of a system, any system, takes commitment, it takes funding, and it takes support. And I struggle with. I wouldn't be able to prioritize that list, nor would I be able to eliminate anything off that list. That would have to come from. I would put that in your hands, Jeff. And if you feel all those things are important, I would have to, take that pretty seriously.
Jeff, can you talk a little bit about 6th Avenue Pump Station and how the DEQ is viewing that particular project?
6th Avenue, when Joslyn Cove development was constructed, they put in water and sewer. They tried to do it on a private basis, but the state came in and said, you have not done this properly from a private side, nor do you have operators and such. So they came to the city and said, really the best outcome of this is if the city took over the water and sewer that was built and the city applied for the permits and then accepted. So the city studied what was built, what was designed, and required some modifications and upgrades. But then also required, the state also required the city to ensure, and every time that there's a tie-in to the sanitary sewer from a main extension, the state requires that you look at the capacity of the receiving sewer and ensure that you have capacity of that. For Manistee, the state required us to look at the sewer line that's along US 31 or Arthur Street out there, but also the pump station at Arthur Street and then the pump station at 6th Avenue until it got in the interceptor under River Street. It was found in that study that the 12-inch pipe that's out there, the gravity pipe, had capacity to accept that development. Arthur Street pump station was right at the capacity, but didn't trigger any concerns. But that 6th Avenue was under the capacity that the state requires. And so as a condition of the permit, required that that lift station be upgraded. At the same time that that was going on, the city was completing an emergency project to repair the access to that station, because there was a driveway with Gabion baskets, and that was collapsing. So the city had designed, installed, bid out, and began creating that stabilization. And at the same time, the state said, well, as long as you've got all this torn up, if we will allow you to start setting some of the structures for the upgrade of that pump station, but you can't put any piping in. So that's why you see out there the 10-foot diameter wet well. That's actually 28 feet down. I mean, it's a big structure. The structure that's next to it is a valve chamber, and so some of those components were put in back when all that was opened up and back when it was excavated. But there wasn't sufficient money, nor did we have the permits at that time, to replace the 6th Avenue pump station. So even though we have a permit requirement to do that. And so that's one of those projects where there hasn't been cash available to fund I don't remember what the number was, $450,000 project. So it's been pushed from year after year, year after year. Same thing with the riverbank and the water tower painting. And kind of came to this point where if we don't have the cash to do any one of these projects, now we have several of these projects. So it makes sense the only way we can afford to finally do these is if we did a bond. And if we did a bond, then let's collect all the projects that are relevant at this time and clean them all up, so that in the future we can use cash to do the rest of the projects. And that's kind of what dictated this list.
I guess what I'm hearing, and I agree with Councilmember Bastiat, that I'm not going to sit here and determine what's important and not important. I think it sounds like we need to do all of them. But listening to other council members on the portable pump and the Century Terrace project, which has been complete, if you take those two projects out, that $78,000, is that something that can be doable within this year and next year's budget, that we can absorb those costs?
I think the question, we can certainly do that, but that's not, with the loss of the $40,000 in revenue, it doesn't complete the rest of it.
We'll handle the revenue. I just want to get it completed. What can council agree on as far as projects and what we feel we need to do with this bond? And the only two that I'm really hearing some argument against is the Century Terrace, because that's already been completed, and a portable pump, which you look at those and that's $78,000. So if we back those out, is this council comfortable then with remaining projects and going with the bond forward?
Well, my question to, I guess, Mr. Bradford then is, if the 40,000 is, or 38, whatever, is eliminated from the bond consideration, and the life of that bond is 1.14 million, are we able to get a bond that would allow us to do the rest of those projects? Or is that going to reduce that amount that much that we couldn't do all those?
What you would need to do ultimately is make up that additional revenue through displacing other expenses in the water and sewer fund budget, or since we've only got 6 months left in this calendar year as part of this next budgeting process, recalculate what those rate increases need to be moving forward and adjust accordingly. So if you don't make up 6 months worth of it right now, it isn't going to torpedo the project. If we don't raise that additional revenue or get another big customer or whatever, match the revenues to our cash needs, then that'll be a problem down the road. But that can be something that can be discussed during this year's budgeting process as well. But you have to service your debt. If you issue the bond, you have to service your debt.
But realistically, it appears, looking at council, that if you're hesitant of raising rates to accommodate $40,000 now, I would assume that you would still be hesitant in the future to raise the rates towards that. So it seems like the only alternative that would make sense in telling you today would be offsetting other capital projects.
Well, and keep in mind, the rate study had an 8.5% and an 8.5% increase, and that was designed, those bigger bumps were designed primarily to fund this bond and
Absolutely.
spread it out over 2 years.
Right.
So if we issued a bond and the council decides, hey, we don't want to do the 8.5% increase next year, that's going to be problematic for the system. So, this isn't tying our hands necessarily on what those rate increases are going to be, 100%, because there's always some room in the budget, but it certainly sets up a scenario where there's going to have to be a rate increase. It just depends on what that magnitude is. Hopefully, we could follow the rate study, and again, that would set us up for
Self-sustainable.
sustainability down the road. That was the whole purpose of the rate study, or one of the purposes of it. But just to be clear, this bond anticipates spreading that over 2 years, that increase, rather than doing it all in year one. And we have some flexibility, which is one of the pieces of information I've got to get tonight on the sizing, to work with our bond counsel and our financial advisor on structuring the bond, and we're going to be talking about that on Thursday. We pushed that back until we had some results from tonight's meeting.
Right, but we need to determine if council believes that any of these projects need to be done. And if we want to reduce our rates, then we have to take off all these projects.
Exactly
Basically.
right. We've
So-
held off on that until we had that conversation tonight.
Right, and from what I'm hearing in council so far tonight, I think everybody believes that these are needed projects, except for 2 of them, and how we fund those projects. And if that's not the case, then we need to speak up and say, no, if we're going to go forward with this bond, then we need to decide how we're going to pay for it, because we have some money that we need to start making up for on that 40,000.
Maywood tank, are we on its last leg as far as the Cody?
Completely.
If we didn't do it this year in 2015, we moved it to 16 or 17.
To be honest with you, when they climb that tower this spring, it might already be too late. I mean, we pushed it beyond the end of the window. We're probably a year, almost 2 years beyond that.
So that number can jump up.
It could jump
Could
up.
this spring.
Yep, and that's one of the reasons why, even though we totaled up these projects and the grand totals at 3.1, the overall bond issue is at 3.5, because there might be a surprise when we go through the design or the
Right.
bidding on one of these.
But to answer your question, Councilor Whittle, if we continue to wait on the Maywood tank, we're assured to triple the price of maintaining that tank.
If we haven't already.
Correct, but if we wait, we are assured of that.
So that it's a clear cut then, correct? That we,
The money that's budgeted on the screen is for an overcoat.
so clear cut.
It's not necessarily a clear coat, but it's an overcoat.
Remember, it won't be the sunset blue, that will no longer be on there, that will be painted over. And I don't know what color we will select on that, but it will be just a clear, a solid color is what it'll be.
All right.
But then that gives it basically a 15-year life expectancy, if that's done.
12 and 14.
12 to 14.
But it was also, if we wait 2 years, we pay the higher amount. It was
Still
also
only-
12
still
and
only
14
12,
years.
14.
Right, so that was kind of
Yeah.
the dilemma.
The no-brainer.
Right. So, just following up on Mayor Kenny, removing the portable pump and the Century Terrace off of that list right now.
And that's what I'm hearing some council members like to see.
So we're, okay. And we can do that.
Other than that, you look at what we really need to do in those big projects, we basically have to make up for that 40,000, if we were to do nothing else, we'd have to take off like over $1 million in projects. And we're just not going to do it with all these little tiny projects. We'd have to move one of those really big projects that we need to do. So I guess my opinion is it doesn't make sense to really nickel and dime this bond if we need to do these smaller projects and pull them all off to get the bond down to where we need it to cover that 40,000. So I guess the way I'm looking at it is that we're going to have to do something with the rates to make up that 40,000. And keep the bond that we go after to keep all these projects except for those two. Unless you guys have any other options or ideas or,
The only problem I have, I'm not saying the stuff doesn't have to be done. How much debt regular citizens absorb? Because, you know, transit taxes will probably going up, water rate's going up here. If you wanted to cover the $40,000 that the RTS took off, was it 15 cents? They're going to put 15 cents on, and then what? Another 8.5% starting July 1, and then another 8.5% starting the following month.
No,
Isn't that how it's going to be played out? You got two years of
You already did
8.5%.
one
You
of the
did 8.5.
Pardon me?
You did 8.5 starting
Okay.
July 1. There'll be another, this is assuming you're following that process. So 8.5 July 1, 2014, 8.5 July 1, 2015, 3.5
3.5 the following
2016.
year.
Right. Right.
With Mr. McCullough's caveat about the retention basin.
And then also, you might as well back up, you're going to have the industrial tank to be painted too. That was done by 2002. So what, that's always that's already 12 to 13 years right there. And your comment is already the paint jobs are good for 12 to 14, so you're already looking at that job.
The catch
You know,
basin,
and then you got the retention basins that are coming up.
The painting, the idea though is that the painting of like the industrial tank would be handled through the capital improvement within the annual budgets, because now and we also have some debt that's retiring. When's the next big retirement? In 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, I'd have to look at the schedule now.
But I think that's the point that the rate study did. It helps self-sufficient, to self-sustain itself. So,
How much debt can our citizens take? Because on the flip side of this, the other conversation is, what everybody knows, even though the agreement today was not to go out for a village, but it's going to be coming, is that you got the streets to do. So, I mean, when you guys start looking at, yeah, we can do this, and then you're going to do this, and do this, and do this, there's some money coming up. There's a wallet with so much money, and you're grabbing it. And there's no more, you guys keep, and there's more and more and more to do.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how much debt that we can take.
The
Just
reality
be
is-
careful how we go down this path, is what I'm suggesting to the council.
and if I remember correctly, those 8% is lower than what the rate study said because we did want to pass on the entire,
We did 50% of that charge.
The 8.5% is a revenue increase. What the rate study did was it put less than what they would normally have recommended into the ready to serve charge.
Right.
They did
Okay.
50% of that, but the overall revenue increase is irrespective of what the structure was, if that makes sense.
okay.
Councilmember Cody, I think what you're describing is that we
A lot of
have,
challenges out there.
well, I think what you're describing is that we have an older utility system that has specific needs to maintain safe and potable water and efficient wastewater treatment plant. We have an NBDS permit that we have to comply with. We know in 2016, based on the schedule that we approved 18 years ago, I think, 18 years ago, that we have to remove CSO 18. You're right, the commitments are large, the challenges are equally as large.
but the alternatives are far outweigh those are decisions that we have to make.
Yeah, I
I
think
mean,
you described it.
it's a sandwich that you have to eat that's not very pleasant, but
Well, I've said this before, we're trying to maintain these utility systems appropriately and not let them get into a state of deterioration like our streets are, where we can't get out of it. And so, you know, I think especially my role is to bring forward from my staff the projects that we feel are appropriate to keep those systems running. And then, but if the funding isn't there, we will prioritize and do our best with it. You know, like we always have.
The challenge for me is that I've been coming to council meetings now for over 4 years, 5 years, every time we seem to get a revenue source, we bond it. We take a bond out against it. Just like we did with the water, we get a revenue source, now we're gonna bond it. We never seem to get on the other side of that. I guess, at what point do we reach where we can no longer borrow our way into the future?
Well, that was what the rate study, I think, is, Mr. McCool.
I'm just talking overall. I mean, at what point?
Well, overall, the debt, you need to carve off the water and sewer utility. Overall, our debt level for the city in general, in terms of general obligation debt, isn't all that burdensome. Most of our debt is on the water and sewer system, and the rate study that council commissioned sets a plan in place, if it's followed through upon, that will hopefully eliminate, if not all, almost all of the needs to borrow in the future, absent something catastrophic. Because what it does is, it starts to fund the depreciation fully, which we haven't done after a period of years. And that way, to the extent that the water and sewer utility management has an extensive and lengthy and as accurate as you can capital project list, you can start to project what those costs are and set aside and orderly fund those projects over time with cash rather than debt. And that saves all of the interest payments that you're making when you have to take out a bond. But in the short term, if you don't have the cash available, the cash flow, you have to be able to finance those projects somehow. And issuing a revenue bond is the way that that's done.
And I think the other thing to remember, in the last few years, our residents are having to make up for the Oaks Prison. We lost a huge revenue stream there. And that's why it's important to have that fixed rate, so when we have huge drops in usage, like we saw at the Oaks Prison, which dropped, God, what was that?
Almost $400,000
a year. I mean, we're trying to make up for that as well. We used to have that revenue stream, and when that's gone, who's going to make up for it? Well,
That has definitely impacted the rates.
So that's something we take
That was
every
a
year.
sacred cow way back with the prison on her. That did everything over. Now we adjusted to that.
And they've been
That went away.
supplementing it.
The sacred cow went away.
And our bigger industries and stuff have been supplementing our residents, and as industry went away and like the Oaks Prison becoming more efficient, those type of things really impacted our rates, what we had to charge to cover, unfortunately.
Couple that with the deteriorating tax base that from home values and such is, I mean, this is a perfect storm.
Stresses everything.
Talk about a perfect storm. When I was out looking at that sewer, the water main break, the 6-inch, and then we had the valve break, and we're looking at pipes that are 80 years old and they're 14 foot down in the hole, and they just crack all the way around and start leaking. Talk about a perfect storm. And we're getting more of that, are we not? We're getting pipes that are breaking and things that are breaking down the solar system.
And it costs money, more money to do it on emergency repair than if we can get somewhat ahead of the storm. But getting back to, does council agree with going out for a bond and trying to cover these projects?
Absent the portable pump and the
Right.
Century Terrace.
I think that there are major projects that we need to do. We need to do that Maywood tank. We need to do the Riverbank sewer line and the 6th Avenue pump station. And those are your major projects. We have to do those. So if we're going to go out for a bond and cover those, yeah, it makes sense if we need those other projects as well to bundle those right now and save ourselves some money down the road initially with, if we can't cover it through the fund. That's my thought.
I hear you talk about having a plan where this money in the future is going to, that we're collecting, we're going to increase the rates and we're going to eventually be able to pay for things for cash. Is that a plan, or are we just talking about it, or is it something we...
Well, what it is, Councilmember Zelinski, is when we did the rate study, we did a financial component of that in the analysis, looking at the project list that Mr. McCullough provided, looking at assumptions regarding operating inflation, assumptions regarding rate increases, and a bunch of things like that, a projection. And what that projection shows is with an 8.5% rate increase July 1, and then 3.5% rate increases after that, which is less than what water and sewer inflation typically is, that over time, as the debt issuances start to get paid off and those monies can be reconverted back into pay-as-you-go capital and maintenance expenses, the need to issue a bond is greatly reduced or eliminated with the exception of the retention basin, which is still needing to be sized. The idea is we're going to turn those debt service payments into funding our depreciation and paying as you go, which is a much more efficient and better use of dollars in the long term. So that's a plan that's set up to do that, but there's a lot of assumptions built into that plan.
So when you say over time, is that 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years?
No, it's a long-term plan. I think we projected out 10 years with that.
The other, I mean, really the utility rate study, one of the end goals of that was to get us in that position. And so the rate structure that's been proposed, and it's going to need to be upgraded every 4 or 5 years, but that lays out the plan, it lays out the blueprints on how we can get there. The other thing that's going to be very important for the utility systems is when we start the asset management program for the water or for the wastewater and the storm sewer systems later this fall, then it will lay out a capital improvement project for plan for 20 years, and it will be matched up to the revenue sources that we anticipate having available. And so we will start replacing some of those components and being able to start prioritizing based on a full asset management program. At the same time, we intend to do the same thing on the water side. And we have a STAR grant that will pay for the storm sewer and the sanitary sewer. But because we're going through all that effort, in fact, I met with the engineers today to talk about how we do that on the water side and had conversations yesterday with the DEQ over it. It won't take a lot of expense for us to mirror that and be able to do the same thing so that, like Ed said, we have a schedule of when we should anticipate being required to paint those towers, or when we're going to have to rehab some of those wells, and being able to schedule those, program those out, and make sure that we've got the cash resources to do that. Right now, we essentially look at things that are breaking, are broken, have run to fail, and then we try to find money to fix those, and we're trying to get out in a much more proactive stance.
I have no questions with a lot of the things we're talking about. Firsthand now, I've been there, done that, looked at those things.
Mm-hmm.
I understand the need, but I'm just very concerned about that we turn this around some way, and I like to hear that. I wish it didn't take 20 years, but I like to hear that we're turning it around and start paying cash for things.
I think the takeaway from what the rate study was trying to do was trying to, one, establish a fair and equitable rate structure for all parties concerned, but more importantly, I think, is lay out a plan for sustainability for the water and sewer utility. I think that's really what it did, to a large degree.
And that will be matched with the SAW grant, which will allow us to do our asset management plan for the sanitary and the storm, and then as Jeffrey just referred to, putting the water in there. So that they're all pieces of the puzzle to having an effective and efficient asset management plan for our utilities.
And I will tell you that in my conversations with the DEQ regulators on both the water and the sewer side, having a rate study, having a sanitary sewer evaluation study, having a water general plan, and having all this stuff forecasted and laid out helps us a lot on our permitting and them enforcing regulations on us.
With the raise in the water and sewer rates, how is that? Because we need more customers coming into the system.
Correct.
We need an agreement with Filer Township to help out Manistee Township. How is that going to affect that? Is that going to torpedo it?
Well, we have torpedo it. Let me answer it slightly different than answer that question. We have not built into this utility rate study that was completed, we have not built any of the agreements with the neighbors to the north or south. Because those would be making assumptions at that point in time. We didn't feel that was prudent for us to build those scenarios into that. I think torpedo probably depends on which side of the aisle you're sitting on. If council, currently we are in conversations right now with Manistee Township. We had a great meeting last week with Manistee Township. We are currently drafting the water service agreement with Manistee Township. We'll be scheduling a meeting with the Council Utility Committee in the near future once they get back to us. Still got to get that done. And they appear to be fine with the water equation. Remember, the utility rate study states water outside the city limits at 118%. So 18%, 18% increase on top of that. Water is what you'd be paying in rate in city. The sewer is a whole different animal. So sewer is a whole different animal. The sewer rate that was established by the utility rate study is 254% of what in-city customers should pay, or a 154% premium, if you will. Premium is not the right word, but you understand what I'm saying. On top of that, if council wants to stay with the utility rate study on both of those as they were identified, I think it's going to be challenging to come to deals regarding sewer with Fowler Charter Township as well as Manistee Township, simply based upon the rate. Now, I think we can justify it. Here's the information, here's how we prepared it. I think it's justifiable. But justifiable doesn't equal affordable or satisfactory negotiations between the two. So I think there's a lot of issues there. In regards to Fowler Charter Township, they have their own water distribution system out there, so they're not needing us to put a water distribution system out there for them. So I don't think it torpedoes it. I think it provides us information that we didn't have before for us to negotiate based upon factual information. But they're still negotiations. And negotiations don't always lead to agreements when you're dealing with difficult topics like this. Now, I think we're really close with Manistee Township for the water service agreement. I really do. They're doing some final checking on their end. They want to get this done. They want to move forward with other developments of sewer with the Little River Band of Iowa Indians. And I think we are really close to Manistee Township for water. I think sewer is going to be a different conversation with them and possibly a little bit more challenging based upon some of the cost structures.
Do we have any idea of with the water with Manistee Township, how many customers we're going to have coming into the system? Is it just the corridor? Is it 31 corridor? Or is it?
Well, it's an interesting question you ask. The initial conversations that we have had with them for, goodness gracious, how long has this been going on? A year? Close to a year, I might guess? Somewhere along that line. For the first 8 to 9 months, maybe 10 months, we had talked about only having this water service agreement for north of M55. So if you can imagine in your own mind, take Myers, the end of Myers, I forgot, I don't know the...
Perry Street.
Perry Street. So imagine Perry Street north to the wellhead as being that individual service district where we had talked about for a long time. In our recent conversations with Manistee Township, they have changed that request. The request now that they're talking about regarding the water distribution system is for all of Manistee Township where there currently is city distribution line. So all the way into Parkdale, and then all the way out to the prison, and all the way into the village of East Lake where the East Lake Estates is at, as well as all the way out north into the airport in Well 10. So that distribution has changed a little bit in association for that. So those conversations are currently being had. So, but it opens it up much larger for that.
But it's revenues we can't count on yet because it's not a done deal. It's not part of what we can count on for the bond or anything moving forward. It's great if it gets there, but...
And we have not counted on any of that revenue.
But it could be a potential upside in the rates that we
absolutely.
can give if those were to happen.
But have they given us any numbers? You know, because you have right across from there, you have a small development. You have a hotel. You have a lot of homes up and down 31.
Well, it would
in East
include.
Lake. I mean, any type of numbers. You know, 100 houses are going to come in.
The draft agreement doesn't, as it's written right now, doesn't, because Manistee Township didn't want it. They're not going to force residential to hook up.
The only time they're
At
commercial
least in the beginning.
Commercial would be required to hook up. Residential would not be required to hook up if they had a functioning well. If that well failed, some language would require hookup, but not if they had a recently developed or functioning well.
Or any new development, build a house out there, that would be,
It's really protecting the existing folks. You just sunk a new well in, I don't know how much a well cost, $4 or $5 grand. They just sunk a new well, they didn't want to force them into a connection. And that makes sense.
But that's going to be,
There's
like you
potential
said,
for future growth.
the commercial side would be hooked up to the city water. Okay. There's, good possibility of future commercial out there, so.
I think that was all part of our thought process, making sure that we continue to work with them. and
Well, I
partner with
think
them.
it's egg and chicken type of thing too. The business development's not going to happen out there without infrastructure that can support it. So we have to get it there. So they
And remember, the water's there. The water's there.
Yeah.
Water's there. Sewer currently is not. Sewer currently is not there. Conversations and discussions, and I think an agreement between Manistee Township and the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians for is it fair to say a gravity sewer collection system? Yeah.
Collection
For
system.
a collection system that can be hooked into are planned for, but it's currently has not been built yet.
Trying to anticipate where you're going, one of the things that we told council when we presented the utility rate study is, if we added some new heavy users, if we added significant users, if we expanded our customer base, or even if we did in 3 to 5 years, probably on that 5-year basis, we need to update the spreadsheets that are in the utility rate study and let those flush out. So if we've come up with another $200,000 a year in revenue from someplace, certainly the needs of the system are the needs, and we're not trying to build profit on this. We're simply trying to maintain the system, service the debt, and not charge more than we need to. So, if we found new revenue sources, then that would have positive impacts on the rates across the board.
The greater we can spread those costs over a larger base, the better we're all going to be.
Well, expanding out north and south is the logical point because, we're landlocked here in town and there's only so much we
West
have
and
to
east
work
is
with.
kind of tough.
So,
They got plenty of water out there.
West and east is kind of tough. Right. Now, I hear your comments. I think they're very, very well pointed. And we all believe that Manistee Township is poised for future growth with both water and sewer out there, and a sewer that can be tied into.
One thing that I would point out, though, we know that when the tribe builds their sewer system out there, we're going to lose several customers from the sewer side, the hospital, medical care, and so the current rates anticipate
Builds that in.
losing those revenues.
Right.
So we've already planned for that to happen because we know that there's an agreement there, and so we've anticipated that.
I think it's fair to say we were very, very conservative. We were probably we wanted to make sure we were going to accommodate all the losses of revenue. We wanted to be very conservative in future growths. If the future growth comes, great. That allows us. It's a fixed cost business. I know they don't like it when I say that, but to me, it's the utilities is a fixed cost business. Whether we take on 30,000 more gallons of water, pump that much more, distribute it, we got to have X number of employees, we got to have X number of ferric into our system, or X number of fluoride and chlorine to treat the system. There's some small incremental costs, utilities and all those kind of things, but really, the costs are fixed with what we have. So the more customer base we can have, the more we can spread that out over a larger base, and it works to everyone's benefit by spreading it out. So it only makes sense to work cooperatively with Manistee Township and Butler Charter Township.
have we done anything with working with Filer, getting back to the board?
And I have left several sessions with Mr. Walker, and my understanding is they're still considering some various options, and when they're ready to come back and have a conversation, they will let us know.
I think the last conversation was they were going to conduct the commercial study.
I think they've completed that, though. I think they've completed their commercial study to determine what their viability is and what their needs are in that commercial study. I think they're evaluating. I think they got back that the first of the year, right before holidays. So I think they're reviewing that right now, and we have, on a couple of different occasions, said that please let us know when you're ready to sit down and have conversations again. So the offer has been extended multiple times to 5 Charter Township. Good questions?
So they're still looking for a direction from council on what we want to do with this bond. These are projects that, the big projects are the ones that I sound like we really need to do.
I don't dispute the need for the Riverbank sewer line and other items that are on here. That's certainly a priority because it's been put off for several years and the cost has increased significantly. Painting the Maywood tank is important, so like I say, we don't triple the cost in that regard. I just get concerned about the rates. When the Ready to Serve was pulled off with the second meter, it didn't have anything to do with capacity. People were using the same amount of water. They were just going through a different meter, and they weren't paying the sewage charge on the irrigation water. So I don't consider that subsidizing one function for another. But it did allow people a savings for irrigation, for the gardening or watering their lawn. I look back in history trying to research some of this, and I know when the Capital Improvement Fund was established, that it was identified for streets and other capital projects. The first thing that happened was $250,000 a year was allocated to lawn service, and I just get concerned that we obligate, like Councilman Zielinski said, every source of revenue that's coming in, and it pulls away from other priorities or other considerations that we may have to work with within the city.
Completely agree.
I'm concerned about the level of the bond. I want to pay for things as we go, as much as possible. I know it's not always practical.
Sure. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I like this. So it actually has a long-range strategy to get us out of that same cycle of break down, borrow, break down, borrow, break down, borrow. It actually starts funding a source for cash as you go. Again, that's why I found it so intriguing and strategic that we put in a plan like this. It would have been great if we 20 years ago did the same thing for the streets and anything else that we have as a depreciation asset, that if we could fund it with a strategy that worked long range. And I think that's what this does. That's why I'm a big fan of it, because it does look for long range success and not just 1 and 2 years out. And we're in a hole. There's only a couple ways to get out. And as Jeff had mentioned, and then Councilman Zielinski said, we could be not too far away from having a couple more catastrophic failures and having significant costs on the system. That's why it's great to have some type of funding system that anticipates that, or at least plans for that.
So are you giving them the go-ahead to pursue a bond for these projects?
I think it's the only option we really have.
Full.
Except for the 2 projects we talked about, which was the Cemetery Terrace CSO and the affordable home.
Yeah, minus the $78,015.
Yes. Not hearing any.
I just want to talk about this pump for a minute.
Sure.
It said in here, the study, I think our engineer said it would cost like $100,000 if we had to rent a pump to do one of these projects, a bypass, right?
They estimated the cost to bypass pump when we do the pump station rehab, such as Sweetenham in the industrial park, could cost up to $40,000 for each of those projects. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then, so what we anticipate doing is utilizing the equipment that we have, and if we had this particular pump, we would utilize that pump and then either rent the whatever piping or anything else that we needed to try to reduce the cost of that. And so our anticipation is just in 2 of those projects alone, we would almost pay for that pump itself.
So you're saying the pump would be able to eliminate the 40,000 or reduce the $40,000?
Substantially reduce it.
Not totally eliminate it, but drive it down dramatically.
Right.
And the thought was not to buy it, it's just to fund it through a different source.
Right, and I just wanted to say to encourage that, only because, again, having first-hand knowledge, seeing the pump that we do have requires a person to be there to operate it. I watched this pump work on YouTube, so I was kind of familiarizing myself a little bit. It's a pretty awesome machine. It could do the job, even could be set up so that it would signal somebody who had a problem. You wouldn't have to have somebody there. So potentially, it's going to really pay for itself, manpower and everything. So I'm hoping that there's money there someplace we can find to buy that pump.
Why would they cannot? But I got a question on that though. Why would we want to submit our pump to that project? Why wouldn't you give that to the contractor so the contractor is liable for any maintenance or any downtime and the liability of that pump failing? Why do we want to assume that? That should be a contractor's problem.
And we can set it up that way. I mean, we can set it up by providing our pump and making them responsible.
And then they come into a gray area, since they're not providing the pump, you're providing the pump, and the pump fails, the contractor says, well, that pump isn't working, it's not your problem, not our problem. If they're pounding it, if we use our equipment in there, in my estimation, it's just about why do we want to use our pump for the contractor? Now that past practice with the damages and all that, but whatever.
Then the
I
reality
would
is,
not go down that path.
the whole goal is to reduce the cost of the project. The only reason we would
Well,
do
why
that-
open up the liability to cost more?
I think that's a fair question. But the whole point of that is that particular pump could reduce the overall cost of the project. That's the goal. Point
There are
simple.
applications at the plant itself too. If this pump could be used to bypass some systems at the pump that would keep our station going.
Absolutely.
And there's an option between a 6-inch and a 10-inch, I believe.
Between 4 and 6.
4 and 6.
You're gonna get a 10-inch pump, holy smoke,
Why don't you know?
don't even think of that.
I know just
$43,000, you're gonna cover 10.
I know just enough about this to get myself in trouble. Okay,
A
so-
4-inch pump would be adequate for us 95% of the time. But when we researched it, the cost to upgrade to a 6-inch, which would meet 100% of our needs, was a couple $1,000s.
And I found that on the internet also,
Yeah.
that the difference would be,
Negligible.
yeah, it would be, why would you not go to the big one?
Right.
I'm sorry, I'm done.
Well, I guess I'm hearing is that council feels that, the majority of council feels that these projects, except for the portable pump and Century Terrace CSO, that we should proceed with the bond, less those. And then as far as funding those, there's some opportunity in the future with negotiations with Manistee Township. We wouldn't have to, as far as liabilities are paying for these, when do you anticipate that we would need to?
The first payment is somewhat flexible. We have an interest payment that we talked about in December of 2015. First principal payment would be June of 2016, unless we capitalize a year's worth of interest and then we push it back another year.
So we have an opportunity, based on future possibilities with the township and looking at this year's budget, to possibly look at what the rates, maybe it would be 15 cents that we'd have to do, or maybe there can be another way that's going to be more palatable for consumers to cover this cost.
I
I'd be
believe
fair to say.
it is fair. I think my recommendation is that the revenue that's needed to make up for the loss based on the rate of surcharge needs to be addressed in the budget that's we're going to be considering in a month or so, a couple months.
Okay, so it's not something we need to really look at tonight, but something that we need to consider it of. And does council agree with that?
Repeat that, please.
Once the bond is issued, we have to pay for it. So that requires that revenue, that 40,000, which it does, needs to be made up in some fashion. It doesn't have to be made up tonight, but it's going to have to be considered as part of the discussion on what the rates and charges should be for the water and sewer utility as part of the 2015-2016 budget.
But what I'm saying, by the time we get to that, to the budget, there may be some things in place that might help lower that, or there might be some other thoughts to make this more palatable. Coming up with some solutions.
There's always more and better information generally as more time goes on.
But does council right now feel comfortable with that, proceeding with the bond, and then looking at how we're going to fund that bond? Knowing that the worst case scenario is a 15% increase in our rates, 15 cents per gallon.
I don't feel comfortable with 15 cents. per
Well, I'm not
gallon.
saying that, I said that would be the worst case.
Oh, all right.
Worst case scenario going.
I'm comfortable with going forward with the bond and having some in-depth conversation of how we fund that loss
Right.
from the ready to serve. I don't know what that looks like, and I agree
Right.
with you, I'm not a fan of throwing it on, the other customers, but we need to strategize how that's gonna look.
I think this is reverse. You better find out where the money's coming before you go out for bonding. When Ben's mistake, they always own up to, is he went out for bonding, then he tried to figure out how to finance it later, and it turned out to be a big fiasco. So I think just the opposite. You better pick out the project and how much, then you go out for your bonding. You better know how you're gonna pay for it before you go out.
I think the worst case scenario right now is a 50% increase in our water rates is worst case to cover
We
this
address it in
bond.
the ready to serve charge.
What's that?
Oh, we could address it in the ready to serve charge, right?
Yeah, I think it was 75 cents a month, something like that. If you just increase the ready to serve on the water to make up that loss, it was like 75 cents per customer.
I'd have to look at the number, I don't recall, but it wasn't a huge number.
But those would be the worst case scenarios, but come budget season,
There may be other options.
there may be other options and some more information that might not make it.
The basically you're committing, and then you're gonna
Right.
figure out how to pay for it.
Well, I just want
We know how, it's either gonna be one or the other being worst case.
All right. This is not what I'm hearing, but okay.
But just, worth repeating one time, this bond,
It'd be better.
It would better fit.
this bond is designed to be paid for with rate increases over a 2-year period that were set at 8.5% and 8.5% revenue increases. So if we get into this budgeting process, and let's say all the facts and circumstances remain the same, and council decides that they don't want to raise the water and sewer rates at all next year, which isn't what the rate study recommends, then we are going to be in a situation where we're going to have to cut things and rather dramatically in order to be able to pay the debt service once those payments start coming due. So anytime you're obligating money out 20 years and it's based on assumptions as to what the rates are going to do and what the volumes are going to be, council just needs to be aware of that out front. But that's how we set that up, so we didn't have a 17% rate increase last year. It was set up to be done over 2 years, so it eased that transition in.
And we're already 6 months into that first rate
Yes.
increase.
Yes,
And
yes.
Now, would the Manistee Township customers pay the bond debt too? Or are they just using the sewer? I mean, just paying the sewer?
They would pay the water ready to serve charge.
Okay.
Because the bond debt is eliminated now.
I'm still asking him to proceed then?
Okay.
I support it.
Because it has come back for council approval, and what we don't want to have happen again, because time is of essence here, is thinking that they have council support, and then when we go to actually vote on it.
And I had long conversations with the bond counsel and the financial advisor yesterday. I'll be having more conversations to finalize the structure on Thursday, and there should be something coming in front of council the first meeting in February for approval.
So I really am not trying to put anybody on the spot, but I really want to give them as accurate information as possible, if this council is supporting this or not. And from what I'm hearing tonight, unless I hear somebody speaks up, I think you have the majority of support from council to proceed.
Thank you.
Hmm?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jeff.
But as long as we get a better pump than the at the campground.
Much better.
You gonna go ice skating now?
Hey, kudos on the executing of the check. After this, and it's really great to see.
Okay, second item we wanted to chat with council about tonight, and I know you've been here a long time, but following up on your conversation we had on December 2nd, we were asked to come back with some additional information on assessing, which is what we're here tonight to present to council. So we made a presentation to council on assessing options on December 2nd, 2014. 3 options were identified in that particular presentation. Status quo, level 3. FTE stands for full-time equivalency employee, so a full-time employee. Manistee County Equalization Department, private assessing contract. And the 4th one, council requested us to research the 4th option, a level 2 assessor, full-time equivalency. So going from a level 2 to a level 3 FTE. So we did that, and we started doing research. I sent out a listserv to all of my colleagues across the state. In addition to that, was able to obtain some information from the Michigan Municipal League. And the information that we got back, and I think what we were trying to find is you were trying to find a bracket as to what's going to be the salary requirements. We know what the personnel costs are, or excuse me, the benefit packages, but what are the brackets if we were going to hire a level 2 assessor? What are some of those costs, and what would be some of the comparable information across the state? So we looked at this. Some of the communities didn't have minimum dollar amounts. It's just what they currently were paying their employees. The Elmwood Township down here, I think I'm just going to highlight a couple of those. The Elmwood Township down here, that's an advertisement in the a magazine that Ms. Spirit provided me. I forgot the Michigan Assessing magazine, I believe, but I could be getting the exact name wrong. That was what they were advertising for a level 2. PM Township, right below, interesting, was advertising for a level 3. They were close. We had talked about them previously, so I put them in here, but I wanted to be sure you knew that that was a level 3, which they were advertising for in Pierre Marquette Township. Manistee County Equalization Department, right below them. This is a unionized employee, so it's contractual as to what they pay those employees. But they're level 2 assessors or appraisers, I think as some are called. That's the salary range that they have within their contract. The Michigan Municipal League survey that I was able to get my hands on was a 2013 survey. It included 19 communities that had level 2 assessors addressed. Based upon the fact that it was a 2013 salary survey, I wanted to make sure we adjusted it for 2014 dollar amounts. So I used the 1.6 multiplier that was applied last year as the state of Michigan cost of living adjustment. So it didn't address it much, but I just wanted to make sure that we were adjusting that 2013 information for 2014 dollar amounts. So what it really came down to, and interestingly, Julie really kind of nailed it when we had a conversation. It came down to a salary range somewhere between $45,000 and $48,000 if you kind of just round those back up a little bit. So I think if you're looking for what the cost would be to have a level 2 assessor in-house running the assessing department, that's the comparables and comparables. The one area that I think is slightly different than some of the other communities, and I didn't contact each and every one of these communities, but several of them, by the definitions and how they laid them out, it was clear that they were not the only individual in the assessing department. Clear that they probably were not the lead assessor in many of those departments. So I think there is something to be said about having the full responsibility of the assessing department rather than being an employee of someone who has that full level of responsibility. I didn't adjust for that in anywhere in here, but I think it's worth having that conversation. So we may need to adjust that up there slightly, as for conversation's sake. So this was the research that we had conducted. If you look at that, again, I tried to just provide some assessing service cost comparisons. So we know that the existing level is $119,862. That's the current budget. The level 2, what I really did is I just reduced I took the 45 and the 48, and I reduced it off what the current salary is for the assessor. I left the financial package the same. We don't know if it's a single family or a double family or double or a single individual, so we don't know any of those costs. So I left that the same. which resulted in potential savings of about $19,800 to $23,800. That's pure salary difference between the existing assessor salary and those previous research numbers. I then compared that to the information we got from Manistee County, where they knew that, we all know, when you saw that letter from them in regards to $83,961, so you can round that up to $84,000, which potentially gave you about a $35,000 savings over, or under, excuse me, the $119,862. And then we also brought in the private assessing contractor, what we thought roughly $60,000 is a little bit higher than what the numbers came in, but still giving you a potential savings of the roughly $60,000, $59,000 to $60,000. Any questions on that particular chart, or
Go back to the previous one, do that one
right there? Okay. I don't know how to blow it out. Can everyone read that clearly?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's what you would ask for. I believe that's what you had requested of staff that we're providing to you. I wanted to go over a couple of other things. I thought it'd be appropriate tonight to talk about some other personnel needs that we believe that we need to have a conversation with Council Personnel Committee in the near future, as well as have conversations with Council coming up in the next fiscal year budget. And I just wanted to just kind of quickly go through those tonight and start giving you some primers on that. So these conversations don't surprise you when we start having them. So we believe there's some other additional personnel needs within the city of Manistee. And just quickly, over the past decade, due to the reduced revenues and cost pressure of the overall workforce has contracted. You've seen that in that chart that shows the reduction of workforce. Reduction of the workforce, I think this is really important. The reduction of the workforce is the primary reason the city is still financially stable. Absent reducing workforces, the population of the employees, we would not have the fund balance we have, and we would not have the stability it is. There's no question about that. We don't build widgets. We have people that provide services, and we reduce those level of people. But what we did not do is we did not reduce the amount of services being provided to the public. We did not reduce those services. We have maintained the service levels of the citizens. So what the end result is, as we all know, when you maintain your service level and you have less employees, you simply spread that out across the base so everyone got additional jobs, responsibilities. We do believe that we are at that capacity where there really isn't additional room for increased responsibilities to be increased across the board. Increased compensation does not follow increased workload. The budget simply didn't allow for it at that point in time. We all understand that. And I believe it's a definite need, kind of still around, no, it's okay. Definite need to reinvest. I try and normally not put that many on the slide so I can read over the top again. Definite need to reinvest in the workforce. I believe that time is now to do so. These are my thoughts. Haven't flushed this out entirely with all the department directors. Have with some department directors, not everyone. I believe we addressed PD last year in the budget. There were some needs the council felt and PD felt, and those budget items were, those personnel items were met. The fire department has done a nice job stabilizing their workforce through part-time, augmenting the staff. They're working great over there. We got 2 more officers who just completed their EMT course. Now they're ready for their national registry of their paramedic, I apologize, they are EMTs, but they're ready to take their national test for their paramedic license. And Chief Bach has done a great job over there blending the departments and providing that level of service. But areas that we do believe still have not been addressed and we're seeing things falling through the crack, and we see this on a daily basis, is identified in the city clerk and finance white paper and the community development white paper. And I'm just going to call it a joint city hall position because I don't have a better name for it today. But this is a floating position, and some of you will remember that white paper where this was discussed. This position would assess multiple departments, including the community development office, That office has been shrunk down, obviously, with the retirement of Ms. Rose a couple of years ago. We didn't replace his position. Denise has done a very nice job elevating herself into that role. She needs some assistance in some of the things that she's doing. We know that for the last couple of years, and the audits have been identified, that there are needs in the finance department for checks and balances. We know that the finance clerk white paper identified a position. And we also know that if we, assuming that we go with contract, which I'm not saying that that's the direction you want to go, but for the sake of this conversation this evening, if we went with contract assessing, we know that there are times when the assessing office and staff also need help, whether it be through board of review or entering of personal property tax data that Julie currently is working with right now with the Manistee County Equalization Department, as we discussed previously, getting some additional help on that. We know that there are times when there's some additional needs. So all of these departments have needs. We don't have the funds to put full-time employees in all of these, but I think one of the concepts we've talked about internally is having a position which would assist multiple departments. And I don't want to use the term floater, but have the ability to work in each one of these departments as necessary. Helping out Denise with various projects that she needs help out. One of the things she really needs help with is, and I can attest to this, it's almost impossible to take the minutes of the meeting you're running. It's horrible. And she does that for both planning and zoning. And she really needs some help and assistance on some of those endeavors. She also needs help when she's in the office on major projects, special projects. So there's a lot of room that she can use help in that one. We've identified some of the help for the finance clerk in the assessing we've also discussed. The other area that I really believe we need some assistance, and that's at the Department of Public Works. With consolidation of the DPW director and the utility director, how many years have been retired?
5.
So for the past 5 years, we have been going through this, working through it, and it's become apparent that some additional assistance is needed to help free up the DPW director to focus less on day-to-day events and operations and more on a higher level management issue. Neither one of those have been totally fleshed out, but I just wanted to give you some introductory concepts about what we're talking about, specifically now that we're soon going to be going into the fiscal year budget. Didn't want anyone to be surprised by some of these conversations that we're having internally from staff. So those are the two areas that we specifically believe internally, me and several other key department directors, believe are needed. So if I'm sitting in council's chair, my question is, how do we fund these positions? That would be the first question I would ask myself if I was sitting in your chair. And my answer to that particular question is, there is the potential to achieve significant financial savings through contracting out inspection, assessing, rental inspections, and allowing the building inspector to perform building inspections. I have an answer for you on Potts Trail, so don't let me forget before you leave tonight on the building inspection side. These savings could be reinvested into our workforce, as previously described, without reducing service levels to the general public. I think that's really important. We're not talking about reducing service levels here. We're talking about service levels being provided in alternative methods than having full-time employees. So based upon that information, my recommendation to council is that we still move forward with contracting out assessing services. So that's what I had for you tonight. I know you still have conversations on that. I'm currently working on, we're still working on trying to figure out what we're going to do. We know we have a deadline in regards to Ms. Beardsley, and working on her separation agreement that council directed us to. So still working on all of those particular issues, but wanted to just open that up for council discussion tonight. Hopefully we can get some direction like we got earlier tonight as to where we need for council to go. Remembering that the assessor is a direct council appointment. It's not like other department directors. This is an appointment that you make. So ultimately, this is council's decision to make as to the organizational model of how assessing is provided in the city of Manistee. Thank you.
Would that include the selection of a contractor?
I think think it would have to, because I mean, I don't think it would have to be honest, Councilmember Gustad, but it makes no sense to me to go through the whole process without having council involvement, and then I take someone to you to have you approve it. It makes much more sense to me, once you provide direction on which way to go, then we form a committee, a search committee, to work cooperatively between council and staff. So when it goes to council as a whole, the council members, my goal, you'd already be confident that you had at least one or several council members on that particular committee who have gone through that process and are comfortable with that direction. I think that may
Disapprove. 3 years ago, we consolidated the fire department and police department to a public service director. That was estimated to have a $100,000 a year savings. The very next year, we elevated a person in the fire department to fire chief and hired an additional firefighter, which incurred an additional cost of $99,000, offsetting the $100,000 savings we looked at the year before. Currently, the fire department is budgeted this year at $936,000 versus slightly over $700,000. So we're $200,000 higher in the cost, and the police department has not reduced cost either. So our consolidation has, in the end, actually cost us more money when it was projected to save money. At the same time, with the building inspections, 2013, we eliminated some part-time positions and created a deputy building inspector position, and part of the stated rationale for that was to provide a backup to the existing building inspector and provide a means of succession to fill that position when the current inspector retired.
correct. I think there's two issues that I think are important in public safety specifically. Number one, the additional revenue that's been brought in through the ALS. A lot of that required more employees to be there. So I think that really needs to be put into your equation when you look at that as the additional revenue that's been brought in through ALS, and significant funds have been brought in through ALS. And I just think that's an important part of that equation also.
I think that was part of the justification
It
for
was.
adding that
It
particular
absolutely was.
employee was that he was going to be offsetting that with additional revenue, which has
Correct.
done that and more.
Right.
Do we know the amount of funds that it brought in a rough estimate?
I think it was a little over $200,000 in the last fiscal year in transport revenue.
200K.
We're 200, like 38 to something like that.
Could have been. Could have been.
I thought,
We can double check that. I think it was over 200,000. It is for a good number for tonight. It's roughly that. But when you look at let's take building inspection for example, just for today. From my perspective, the numbers simply don't make sense. They just don't make sense. Over the last several years, we've been averaging, if I recall the number right in my head, and actually I can probably look it up. We've been averaging a little over about $8,000 in revenue from building inspections. I think it's a little under that. The market's picking up a little bit. We're doing a little bit better. There could be some more building inspections. Even if you put a 25% multiplier on top of that, that brings you probably to about $11,000 for building inspections. I know I took some notes on that. I'm just going to pull those up real quick. Then you got to throw in rental inspection, a little bit on that. And we've been averaging a little over $8,000 in rental inspection. We haven't been able to keep up with the rental inspection about how much we should have been in the past, so I think there's some additional revenue on that. But even again, if you put some multipliers on there, when you add those two numbers together, you're in the $18,000 to $20,000 range. I think Blight's been picked up nicely by the police department in Southern West School. I think they're going to do a fine job on that. So when you look at the numbers, the salary and the benefits for the previous building inspector were in the $75,000 range, is what it came into. I think we were slightly above that. from my perspective, the numbers just don't make sense. We can contract out the building inspection with the state of Michigan. They'll be responsible for that. Probably not as expedient as having our own building official. I think that's fair to say. It wouldn't be as expedient. We use the state inspectors for mechanical, plumbing, and electrical. So the only thing we provide right now is building. The townships are around us use the state inspectors for all of those different things. So I'm looking at this from a financial sense and a business sense. Do these make sense to continue providing in-house building inspection? And I don't see personally where the numbers make sense to me for building and rental.
On those inspections, you can set that out where they receive a percentage or even 100% of the
You can.
fee. Where's that costing the city?
Yeah, and we bid that out, and we bid it out. We could bid it out again, and we bid it out, and we did not get one return on an RFQ for a contract building inspector. That'd be my preference, that we negotiate that, but we didn't get the returns of that. Whether that's not because there's not a lot of licensed building inspectors in Northern Michigan, I don't know, but we did not get one. So from my perspective, it makes perfect sense to contract out that service. The question was asked earlier, how much more do you contract out? And I think the answer is, you contract out positions that make sense. I don't think you can. I mean, I think you look at every single position independently and you evaluate it. And if it makes sense financially to contract that out, that service level, and we can provide a equivalent level of service to the citizens of Manistee, then to me that makes perfect sense. If we can't, and if by contracting it out we reduce the service level and we find that unacceptable or it's more efficient to do it in-house, then I think we keep it in-house. So I think each one of those positions are a case-by-case scenario. And both of these are two areas which my belief is the cities across the state are moving in this direction.
Back in the mid-90s, we contracted out before your tenure with, trying to think of the engineering firm.
It was
Northland, yeah. Do we have of course that's 20 years ago almost. Do we have any comments, track record on how they performed? I mean, before we make a jump like this.
Well, I don't know. I think that was, I forgot the gentleman's name, Bruce. Remember John Kiefer? John Kiefer. John Kiefer provided that level of service. I've never heard anything bad about John personally in providing that service level. So my understanding is the reason we took it in-house is when we did rental inspection. When we brought rental inspection into the city of Manistee and we passed that ordinance to provide rental inspection, then it was believed that that made sense to have a full-time employee.
And John moved away.
Correct.
Right.
He's at LTAP now in Marquette. I can definitely do some research on that to determine that, but I'm unaware of any pro or con. And probably maybe one of the best persons in my know, that's John Rose, to be honest with you. He would have had, so
I think it's something that maybe we should have.
Sure.
A little ammunition here. So.
Sure, understand. And the other aspect about the building inspection is slightly interesting, and I think I put that in the last weekly update, but just quickly, if council chose to move in the direction of contracting the state of Michigan, it's going to require us to pass a resolution to amend our council ordinance that requires us, that allows us to do building inspection. So we had to pass an ordinance in whatever in the 90s when we took over building inspection to provide building inspection internally in-house. The state of Michigan, if they're going to do this, they require you to pass a resolution to rescind that ordinance. So my belief is I would treat that the same as I would treat any ordinance, whether it be Councilmember Zelinsky was in the office the other day wanting to talk about a banning of feeding of the deer ordinance. So whether it's that ordinance, I would treat those all the same, and I would take that to the council ordinance committee, and then that would require 2 readings to move forward. So there's some time to get that information together. Initially, the state of Michigan told us that all you have to do is write us a letter. So we contacted them back, and they said, well, that's not exactly what we need. Here's what we need. So I'll definitely do some double checking on what the satisfaction level is. But to be honest, the satisfaction level is not going to be really good with Nordland. It's going to be where the satisfaction level was John Kiefer. It's always about the individual doing the job. And if the individual is really good, that's really the face of the organization and the face of that different level of building inspection.
I'm going to talk about the assessor.
Yes, sir.
I brought up the website, Ludington website,
Mm-hmm.
and I looked at their first page. They have a level 2 assessor, which we all know, doing the work. They also have 2 contact people, assistants, or that are assistant to that assessor that do some of the work. Anyway, I got really curious. I was in Ludington, so I stopped in, took a copy of their expenditure budget sheet because I couldn't understand it. Got some information. And I'm giving this information because I think we can go in-house, and it's not going to cost us much more or any more. I have a copy of their contract that they have also with the assessor. The assessor gets paid $24,000 plus $7,000 at the end of the year. I guess it's like a bonus thing. Comes to $31,000. They pay another $5,000 to the county, which brings it up to $36,000. The county is a level 3 that they require.
Yep.
I'm reading the contract, and we would be responsible, according to this contract, we kind of follow this along, we're responsible for everything, all the computer, all the software, all the material that he would need. There are certain days that he would work. If he works beyond that, some fees are negotiable, some are set in stone, like with the tribunal, that type of thing. I think it's pretty much a wash. I think when you get all done, it's pretty much a wash.
No, I don't.
That 21,000, are you saying that they're an employee? You can pay 21,000?
No. That's the contract. It's 36,000.
Actually, their costs actually go up because now they take, is how the treasurer explained it to me, and it probably makes sense to Ed, you guys, more than just me, but there's a percentage. They figure that this employee, this assistant, spends a certain amount of her time doing this assessing job so that there's money coming out of the budget for that. And there's actually 2 of those people that do that.
Yeah, what I...
And she also told me that they do a lot of work for the assessor. They load a lot of information on the computer for that assessor.
If you recall...
By the way, there was nobody there that day.
Yeah. If you recall, the conversation that we presented previously, and I don't know if I can pull that memo up, is that Ludington was one of the prime examples that we talked about with the contract. And what we showed is we showed the $31,000 for the contract. Thank you for the $5,000. I called John Shea, the city manager, for that. So say that'd be $35,000 or $36,000. But then we also added in there that he had estimated, personally the city manager had estimated that they spent about $30,000 in personnel costs associated with that. So all of those numbers were brought in to the information that we were provided to you. And their cost would be roughly total cost from their position. He thought $61,000, but if you add the $5,000 in for the contract, so they're roughly $66,000 for their contract, which really isn't all that far off from what we're talking about assessing.
Can you go back 1 page?
Sure. Fair?
Yep.
Okay. So my only comment is that I think you're right on cue with what they're talking about. They spend about $60,000, $60,000 to $65,000 for assessing. They got a few more parcels than we do, and you got to take into account for that. And we spend $119,000 for assessing.
But if we hired a level 2 at the current rate,
If we hired a level 2 at the current rate, would we go back to this?
Yeah, we wouldn't be spending.
Your savings would be down here rather than here. Give or take. And we won't know that until you want to go back to the other one?
No.
Okay. And we won't, and some of these we won't know until you hire, you negotiate, you do an RFQ, you do an RFP, you do an advertisement for the position. So I think we're right on the same thought process. And that's why we created this chart right here, was to show some of those potential savings for you to consider. And again, the assessor, like the building as well, the assessor absolutely, it's a council position. I've made my recommendation to you, whichever direction council majority wants to go, then we'll start that process to build that into the budget and start working in that endeavor.
Well, I called a few other places. I called another place that I know the people that work there is Clark County, because that's where I've done some time, so to speak. They actually pay $600 a day for their assessor. They pay them by the day when they come in.
Okay.
Which is kind of an interesting contract. I haven't seen the contract, but I mean, it seems to be all over the board how we do it.
Oh, I bet you're right, it is.
Yeah, but I'm for it else. I think I want to stay there. When I went to Ludington, I couldn't talk to anybody. I ended up talking to the treasurer. Nobody could talk to him about assessing, except the treasurer. There's nobody there. When I make phone calls, a lot of times nobody there to talk to me. I have to call back on a certain day. If it's going to be that close, we're already collecting $92,000 in administrative fees. The resources are there to pay for it.
I just believe that there is a better use of those funds, respectfully.
You know, we've cut and cut and cut our labor, and we keep saying that there's going to be a decrease in service levels, and we really have not. We've been able to maintain those service level. We did cut back in assessing hours.
We did.
Available to the public. The public became accustomed to that. I've not heard a lot of backlash or bad things from.
I think Julie does a really nice job juggling those folks coming to her office.
So at some point, I am willing to try the private assessing and see what that. We're losing Julie, so this is a perfect opportunity to see if a private contractor would work instead of letting somebody go and trying it and then finding out it's not working.
I've got 2 points in that, and I agree in that respect. The first of which, I don't want to see a decrease in service levels to our residents, and Julie led to that several times, that her workload right now is at a limit. I mean, she's got more work than she has time for. We put a level 2 in there and put that workload on them. We're not setting that up for success at all. I don't believe. And so I have had a real concern with that. My other point would be that if we did kind of do private contracting and it worked well and we were able to save the $60,000 a year, we're in a better situation. If it doesn't work well in a year, we go back and hire. I think it gives us an option. It gives us both options and some flexibility in that respect. But ultimately, and Ms. Beardsley was clear that I don't want to see a reduction in the services to our residents. And if we can work through a contract that ensures some of the same stability that she's put in place from a structure standpoint, I'm more for allowing an opportunity for a contractor to come in and provide those services. That's my opinion.
What is the length of contracts? Is it all negotiated, 1, 2, 3, 5?
I think it would be negotiated. I think you would have, my assumption is that the contractor would like something more than a year, probably.
This one is 3 years with there's a clause in there that either party can terminate with a certain length of notice, certain.
That would be in any contract.
Absolutely.
There would be a
Yeah.
6-day clause. What is that? A 90-day clause? Something like that. There'd be a 30, 60, 90-day termination clause on both sides. On both sides. But I think that would be really up to council and staff to determine what's the best interest. How long would a contract be?
I hear what Mr. Augusta is saying, but along that same line is that if level 2s are doing it in areas that require level 3s, and they're getting the job done, then a level 2 could get it done. What I'm finding out is it's all about technology today. They buy good technology and they're able to do a lot more with less. That's what I'm hearing from the people that I ask questions about too.
Okay.
And so I don't see where the work with Julie's overburdened. I don't see where that's going to make a difference. I think level 2 could do the job.
Okay.
From what I see, there's working other places. Should get the job done, obviously.
If we could, Ms. Beardsley, I mean, do you believe a level 2 could handle the workload that you have right now without any assistance because we don't have any extra personnel and still provide the level of services you're able to do? Ms. Beardsley?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm frankly, I'm pretty confused right now, to tell you the truth. Mitch has something on the board that says you're going to have staffing in the assessing office, that's his position, yet you want a contract assessor, but maybe a full-time, but, oh, if you hire a full-time, then, oh, there is going to be additional staffing. So, to tell you the truth, I'm frankly very confused about what's going on here. I'm not understanding. I've been begging for help since 2010, and I come here tonight, and on the screen, oh, we're going to consider adding a full-time employee, which I've asked Mitch to do for 5 years. So, you know, I'm confused.
That's a replacement, not an addition. That level 2.
No, that's not correct.
The additional office.
He had something on the board that talked about a joint city hall position.
It would not be stationed full-time in the assessing office by any stretch.
So, to be quite frank with you, I'm really not sure how to answer your question because I'm not really sure what the basis of the question is because are you talking staffing or are you not talking staffing? Or if you're going to staff the department, maybe I shouldn't retire. I mean, well, what?
I guess
I'm not getting it.
if there wasn't an extra headcount and there was status quo and we put a level 2 in the position you're doing currently,
If she can't do it now, how can somebody else do it? I'm not trying to interrupt you, and I'm sorry that I did. And please, I mean no disrespect to you. But if she's behind and she's swamped now, of course, you need another body. It's what you're saying.
that's the point I was trying to make to Mr. Zielinski was status quo with a level 2 isn't going to, we're going to set that person up for major failure. And that's not a position I think we should be in. As if we go status quo and hire a level 2, they're not going to be successful. And I think services levels would drop off, and I think we would be in a bad spot.
I don't think it's really, to answer your question just partially, it's not about a level 2 as much. I mean, you've already made a decision that you're going to hire a level 2 assessor. That in itself, the reason you have a level 3 assessor is because the former city manager looked at the complexity of the assessing issues in the city of Manistee and decided that a level 3 assessor would have more experience in the industrial area of assessing. And that's been proven in the last 3 weeks as I'm attempting to settle for the second time, the 4th consecutive tax year, an appeal that's gone on with Morton Salt for 4 years, which was settled amiably, and then Morton Salt comes back that following year and asks for another reduction. And it's taking every bit of skill and negotiation experience that I've accumulated in 39 years to try to settle this appeal. You're talking about $1 million loss of value. It takes an extremely sophisticated skill set to even begin to negotiate because these representatives from Morton Salt are extremely aggressive. So that's just one example. I mean, it goes on and on, but I'll just leave you that as an example. And the bottom line is the workload is the reason the workload has been manageable between 2010 and 2015 is because the economy has been in a slump. As soon as the economy starts to pick up, the workload starts to increase. And if the economy continues then you're going to have an increased workload. So the assessor has been primarily responsible for implementing a lot of different tax exemptions, industrial facilities tax exemptions, exemptions for function obsolescence, all of those. So, you know, it's hard to tell. It's very hard to tell. I would not, if I was in your position, I would not simply say you're setting a level 2 up for failure, because it's pretty apparent that things are going to change in terms of staffing. So there are certain times of the year where you need assistance. There are certain times of the year where you don't need assistance. If there's somebody available during those times, now is one, between December and March, is really the busiest time and where you need the assistance. If that was available, probably be fine.
Thank you. Hey, Judah, before you go, you discussed the Morton Salt issue and how time-consuming that was. A situation like that, how's that going to leave us with a contract assessor? Are we still going to have the same level of interest and effort from a contractor to resolve
Just let
this
me
issue?
put it this way. I live here. This is my community. This is my home. The most precious part of this community in terms of operation is the tax base. If you do not preserve the tax base, it's not going to be sufficient to provide the amenities and the growth and pay the bills. You won't have to worry about a street ad hoc committee. You won't, because the tax base will dribble right down the drain. My job, even though the tax base has declined, the huge part of my job has been to try to preserve the tax base. It's no coincidence that I lost my staff when the tax base started to decrease. I don't think that that was an accident, but preserving the tax base in this day and age is every bit as important as making sure that property is assessed at equitably and uniformly in accordance with true cash market value. They're equal, if not more. Is that kind of what you were?
That's where I was going. I'm very comfortable that you provided a good long-term service to the community. I'm very comfortable with the thought that we would replace you with an assessor, an employee, as opposed to a contract. I think that serves the best interest of the citizens and to preserve the tax base, to have someone that has a vested interest here as opposed to someone that's putting in a certain number of hours or a certain number of days under a contract basis. It may cost us more, may cost us less. It's sort of an unknown. I just look at other things like I brought up when we consolidated public safety. We had a savings and now we don't have a savings. We've consolidated in the Public Works Department and now we've identified a need for an assistant in the Public Works Department. Sometimes there's more workload that materializes over a period of time than a person can reasonably handle, and those things need to be responded to in order to provide a service to the community. And I thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Councilman Gus, with all due respect, I just want to ask another question, try to understand where you're coming from. If a level 2 contract or level 2 in-house can't do the job, how would a level 2 contract assessor do the job?
Well, again, they may have resources outside of what we would provide into. The consultant may have assistants that they work with. We build the contract in a rate structure that says this is the workload you have to accomplish. How you get it done is up to you.
According to the I've only read one contract, but according to the contract I did read, we're pretty much responsible for that. We give them the tools, and like the tribunal and stuff she's talking about, that's extra pay. We'd be paying them extra to go through that, according to the contract. So, I mean, a level 2 is a level 2. They can either get the job done or can't get the job done to me.
It's all like
I'm just trying to
negotiations.
understand.
I would caution you on using the Ludington contract as the only basis point of how we're going to go.
That's, okay.
Yeah, I think
that's the only one that I have right now.
I understand that, but and that may be a great template if we chose to go in that direction, but
I've read other contracts online. They seem to be pretty similar. Days of how many days you have to report may be different. Pay ranges are different, but they're all pretty similar. They're all pretty standard contracts.
Then in a contract, you set what service, what level of assessor that you want.
I mean, that would be identified in the RFP.
Right.
We would identify the service level in the RFP, and then the RFP would almost be the basis from drafting the contract, but the expectations, if council chose to go in that direction.
And Mayor Pro Tem Smith made the comment that having somebody in-house because they lived here would be, pay more attention. That's assuming that that employee lives within the city limits.
But someone that's an employee of the city, I feel is going to have a much greater vested interest in what happens within the city and preserving the tax base. We no longer require employees to live within the city to work for the city across the board. So
State law prohibits, state law prohibits it.
25-mile radius, right?
I don't remember what the, public safety is 25 miles is per, maybe 30 miles, 25, 30 miles is a public safety one, and I don't know if there is the same one for non-public safety. And that's due to immediate response and emergency response. So I'm just trying to kind of understand where everyone is at so I know the direction. And so I have Councilmember Gustad talking about contract assessing. If I have Councilmember Zelinski in-house level 2, Mayor Pro Tem Smith in-house level 2, Mayor Kenny contract assessing, and for the rest.
I'm in in-house, sir.
Okay.
I'm in-house.